Hello, I'm Georgina.
Hello, I'm Ruth.
Welcome to Minds Thrive.
Well, welcome Dr. Trevor Powell, consultant clinical neuropsychologist, one of my favourite clinicians. Trevor, tell our audience a little bit about yourself. So you're an author, aren't you, as well? You've written several books.
Yeah, I have worked as a clinical psychologist for 40-odd years, and over that period of time, written a number of books. I wrote the Mental Health Handbook, and then a book on brain injury, and more recently, a book on autism, or two books on autism. The last one was called Recognising Autism.
Brilliant. I think I have pretty much all your books, and they're enormously helpful.
Thank you, Georgina.
She's your number one fan, Trevor. I think you're marvellous as well. So
Stop it, please.
Today we are going to be talking about diagnoses and specifically the history of diagnoses. Trevor, where would you start?
Well, I would start in 1911 when Swiss psychiatrist Egon Bleuler was the first person to use the term autism, and it was used as an aspect of schizophrenia, where he talked about people withdrawing into themselves. So the word autism actually is the Greek word for self, auto, self. So it was 1911, that was the first time it came onto the books, so to speak, and it was seen as a type of schizophrenia. The next major milestone in the history of autism was in the 1940s. There were two researcher clinicians, an American called Leo Kanner, who published a paper describing 11 children who had this form of social withdrawal and communication difficulties, but were above average IQ. And Kanner's theory was this condition was caused by bad parenting, basically, cold, perfectionistic, refrigerator mothers.
Oh, I remember that. So it was him who coined the refrigerator mother phrase.
He did, and then he came to regret it, actually. I think he felt bad about it. But for 20 years, with the kind of the heyday of Freudian analysis, it was all down to your relationship with your mother. So in the 40s, there was Leo Kanner in America, and in Europe, there was a guy called Hans Asperger who wrote a similar paper, but he talked about these children. It was all based on children as having intense interests, special language skills. He termed them as little professors because they were very adult, got on better with adults than their peers, had high IQs, and so he coined, his name, Asperger, then later in the century became associated with people with autism that were high functioning, that were above average IQ. In terms of the diagnostic classification, the DSM, which is the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, the American classification of medical psychiatric diagnoses, the first one was in 1952, which did include the word autism, but again that was under the umbrella term of childhood schizophrenia. There was another DSM came out in 1968, and similarly, autism was still under childhood schizophrenia. Then in the 1970s, there were lots of research, neuroscience research, looking at genes, twin studies, and the movement moved away from the notion that it was down to early attachments and relationship with your mother, and it was more a recognition that this condition has strong genetic links. People who have children are more likely that those children are going to have autism, or in twin studies there was evidence to suggest that yes, this is a largely genetic condition. And then probably the next milestone was in the mid 1970s. A British psychiatrist called Lorna Wing, who had a daughter who had autism, came up with the notion of the autism spectrum, i.e., it's not an all or nothing thing, but there is a spectrum of severe to mild types of autism. And she coined the phrase, "the lines are all smudged," which I personally like.
I like that as well. Yeah, rather than having a sort of a crisp cut off, like a switch,
Yeah.
that things are kind of smudged and blurred.
Yeah, which is often, when you're doing diagnoses with adults, that you do realise that the lines are all smudged, and there is a spectrum. So that was her contribution, and she actually did coin the term Asperger's syndrome after the Austrian physician Hans Asperger.
I think many people mourn the loss of the term Asperger's syndrome. I think people identified with the Asperger's, and we've lost it now, haven't we?
Well, you were just prompting me to go back to the DSM-5, because the DSM-3, which came out in 1980, did have a number of subtypes of autism. It had high-functioning autism, Asperger's syndrome. It had a condition called pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified,
Snappy title.
i.e. PDD-NOS. Now, if you're going to walk out of a clinic with that round your neck, it's not much fun, is it? Oh, I've got PDD-NOS. Anyway, the DSM people in 2013 decided to merge all these subcategories and just have autism spectrum disorder. So, controversial move, because a lot of people would say, somebody with Asperger's is very different from somebody with classical autism. So somebody with Asperger's might be, a scientist, or a genius, might be the richest man in the world.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody with autism might be living in a residential care home, not able to live independently, and needing, long-term support. So, to put those two people in the same bag is kind of it has its pluses and its minuses. But as you say, a lot of people like the term Asperger's and find that it's something they miss.
So why has that term gone out of fashion?
Well, I think that probably two reasons. One is things were getting a bit complicated in terms of categorising, and maybe they thought it would just be simpler to call it all autism. Asperger actually was Austrian-German, and there was some mention that he might have been involved in the Nazi Party. That was actually refuted later, but at the time, Asperger became a bit of a kind of naughty word. Oh, Asperger, involved in eugenics or whatever. I looked at it briefly, but it didn't look like there was much evidence. But it became less popular. That wasn't the reason that they merged everything into autism spectrum disorder, but I think it had something to do with it. But I suppose the next progression from the DSM-5, which is 2013, is the recognition that there is a kind of neurodiversity movement. And what that means is that people with autism, people with ADHD, people with dyspraxia, dyslexia, are saying, hey, I've got a differently organised brain. I've not got a medical condition. In fact, I don't think I've got a disorder. My brain is just differently wired up. And in fact, we've all got differently wired up brains. I'm slightly dyslexic. not very good at detail, spelling, grammar, remembering sequences. Never have been. Never got a diagnosis, but being a neuropsychologist, that was my realization. In fact, I remember years ago meeting this lady who was doing a PhD in adults with dyslexia. And she said, oh, yeah, a lot of adults, when they were at school, they couldn't do sciences, they couldn't do languages, and they ended up doing things like geography, economics, art. I said, hang on a minute, that's exactly what I did. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, the notion that we all have slightly differently wired up brains, and that the wiring for autistic people is the bits that are heavily wired up, like kind of 8-lane highways, are the bits of the brain that are to do with systematizing, logic, rules, memory, attention to detail. That's highly wired up. The bits of the brain that are to do with the social and emotional world are not so well wired up. You might think of it as a country lane compared to an 8-lane highway. So if we look at the kind of history of autistic people who have made a contribution to the world or been considered geniuses or scientists or great artists, you often find that they're people whose brains or personalities are a little bit unbalanced. One side is really good, the technical systematizing, but the aspect to do with the social and emotional world is often a little bit lacking, and that's an area they struggle in. So, where we're at the moment is that neurodiversity, we've all got different brains, and if we can plot the profile of our own brains without, judgmental or medicalisation, that's a helpful thing to do.
I agree. I quite like the we aspect of that, as in we all have different wiring, and there are labels that can help us understand that wiring. So, for example, autism can help understand the sort of attention to detail or the struggle with the social. Dyslexia can help to understand the wirings you talked about. But it talks about us as human beings all having different, I suppose, strengths and challenges.
Yeah, that's right. I think, it's, we've all got a brain, we've all got a different brain. So the notion that, the old-fashioned notion where a teacher stood in front of a class of 30 pupils and you've all got the same brain, and, that's now, hopefully, there's a shift away from that, and actually, out of those 30 school children, some of them might have more autistic-y brains, and some of them might be more ADHD brains, and some of them might be bog standard brains. And, not that there is such a thing, but
there's something about having understanding and compassion towards difference. So I took my children to the Blist Hill Museum in Iron Bridge at the weekend, and you go back into the past and you see a Victorian school, and we had a teacher explaining to us what it was like and how, if you didn't understand things, your hands got wrapped with the cane. Yeah. And you had the dunce's corner, didn't you? Where God, yeah. There was such condemnation of people who perhaps struggled in certain areas. And I think we've moved away from that in many ways. But I was recently looking at an article which was, again, condemning us, the clinicians, for over-diagnosing. I think it was ADHD in this case. And part of me felt quite sad because there's such a relief in finding an explanation for the challenges that you face. So as a dyslexic person, kind of growing up in the early 1980s, when we were just starting to understand dyslexia, I was in a school that really was not embracing it and not accepting that. No, dyslexic children don't go to this school. And that actually was a problem, because understanding, okay, it's not that I'm stupid, I'm wired a bit differently. Now I understand myself, I can adapt to the challenges that I face.
Yeah, time and again. Well, I was trained like sort of anti-diagnosis in my training, but actually, time and again in clinical work, when I've spoken to people about their experiences of having a diagnosis, there's an enormous sense of relief and a sense of being able to make sense of the things that were so confusing. Like, oh, it's not this, it's that.
Yeah.
So a lot of the people that we see in our clinics, I would say, have significant challenges. And I get really distressed when I see these articles where they're trying to snatch away that little bit of validation that they've finally experienced. So it's, okay, I get it. I get why I struggled.
Yeah. I think, it changes the narrative that a person has about themselves. And often people will say they're greatly relieved to get a diagnosis, and it means that I'm not a bad person, I'm not a stupid person. It's just my brain is wired up slightly differently.
Trevor, when you look at the history, and having worked in this field for so many years, do you have a sense of the direction of travel of where we're going with this?
Yeah, I think, having run a service that provides diagnoses, formal diagnoses, I think the world is moving away from formal diagnoses, more towards self-identification. And if you can give people the tools to diagnose themselves or work out their own profile without having a medical label, I think a lot of people will say, give me the tools and I'll do it.
Now, Trevor, I know that this is a passion of yours, isn't it? And it's something that you've been working on. And so I guess what I'd like to do is invite you to do another pod with us on that particular topic of self-diagnosis. Would you dare? Would you come back? Would you talk to us again?
Yeah, I'd love to. Yeah, I find it really interesting.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Trevor. It's been an absolute joy talking to you on this topic.